The notification pinged on Ezra Jackson's phone, slicing through the quiet of his Brooklyn apartment like a gunshot. Ezra Jackson, 28, passed away tragically. The words blurred as his heart plummeted. Not because he was dead, but because his family had declared him so, because he was gay. By the time he clicked the link to the viral obituary, shared thousands of times across social media, his hands were trembling with rage and betrayal. Ezra leaned back against the worn couch, the city's hum filtering through the open window. It was 2025, and New York thrummed with life. Taxis honking, street vendors calling, the distant pulse of a subway train. He was very much alive, his pulse racing as he scrolled through the comments on the obituary posted by his estranged family in Atlanta. Such a loss, one read. He was so young, another mourned. Lies all of it. His mother, Pastor Evelyn Jackson, had orchestrated this, her final act to erase the son who refused to repent for loving who he loved. 3 years ago, Ezra had come out to his family at a tense Sunday dinner. The memory still stung. His mother's face hardening, his father's silence, his sister's tears. "You're dead to us," Evelyn had spat, her voice cold as the church pews she preached from. He'd left Atlanta that night, building a new life in New York as a graphic designer, finding love with Mateo Alvarez, a community organizer with a laugh that could light up a room. But now this obituary, a cruel public disownment, threatened to unravel everything. Ezra's phone buzzed again. Mateo's name flashed on the screen. "You okay, amor?" His voice came through, steady but laced with worry. Ezra exhaled, the sound shaky. "They're holding a funeral, Mateo. My funeral. Next week." The words felt absurd, like a line from a dark comedy. Mateo's silence on the other end mirrored Ezra's shock. But then his partner's voice returned, fierce. "We're not letting them get away with this. We're crashing it." The idea was reckless, insane even, but it sparked something in Ezra. A fire he hadn't felt since he'd walked away from his old life. He wasn't just going to crash his own funeral. He was going to do it live on the internet for the world to see. His family wanted to bury him. He'd show them he was more alive than ever. The next morning, Ezra and Mateo sat at their small kitchen table, laptops open, coffee cups steaming. Their friend Lila Chen, a 27-year-old tech whiz with a knack for hacking and a heart for justice, joined them. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she pulled up the funeral details from the church's website. "They're streaming it on their platform," she said, her eyes glinting with mischief. "We can hijack the feed." Ezra hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. What if this backfires? What if it just makes things worse? His voice was raw, the weight of his family's rejection pressing against his chest. Mateo reached for his hand, his touch grounding. "It won't. You're not just doing this for you, Ezra. You're doing it for every kid out there who's been told they're wrong for who they are." Lila nodded, her ponytail bouncing. "We've got this. I can patch you into the stream and we'll broadcast from here. You tell your story. Live. In front of their congregation and anyone watching online." She grinned. "Think of it as your grand re-entrance." The plan took shape over the next few days. Lila worked her magic, ensuring they could override the church's live stream. Mateo reached out to their network of activists, rallying support from queer organizations across the city. Ezra, meanwhile, wrestled with what he'd say. He wasn't just confronting his family. He was exposing their hypocrisy to the world. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying. By the night before the funeral, their apartment was a hive of activity. Friends dropped by with takeout, offering encouragement and ideas. Jamal, a 30-year-old drag performer and Ezra's closest friend, insisted on helping with his stage presence. "Honey, you're about to serve truth," he said, adjusting Ezra's collar with a flourish. "Make it iconic." Ezra laughed, the sound easing the knot in his chest. But as the group dispersed and he lay in bed with Mateo, doubt crept in. "What if they don't care?" he whispered. "What if they just double down?" Mateo pulled him close, his breath warm against Ezra's cheek. "Then we keep fighting. But they'll hear you, Ezra. The world will." The morning of the funeral dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that felt like it was holding its breath. Ezra stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. He'd chosen a bold red one, a defiant splash of color against his black blazer. Mateo, in a navy sweater that hugged his frame, watched him with quiet pride. "You look like a warrior," he said, kissing Ezra's temple. Lila set up her tech in the living room, her monitors glowing with code. The church's stream was scheduled to start at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they timed their interruption for the eulogy, Evelyn's moment of performative grief. Ezra's stomach churned as the clock ticked closer. He thought of his mother's voice, her sermons about sin, her refusal to meet Mateo when Ezra had begged her to visit. At 10:55, Lila gave the signal. "We're in." The church's feed appeared on her screen. Rows of pews, mourners in black, his mother at the pulpit. Ezra's breath caught as he saw his own face projected on a screen behind her. A photo from his college graduation, before everything fell apart. The obituary's lies echoed in his mind. "Tragically taken from us." Mateo squeezed his hand. "You've got this." Ezra nodded, stepping in front of the webcam. Lila hit a key, and the church's stream flickered. For a moment, the congregation saw Evelyn's face. Then it cut to Ezra, Liv from Brooklyn, his eyes blazing. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "My name is Ezra Jackson, and I'm not dead." The chat on the stream exploded. Comments flooded in shock, confusion, support. Ezra kept going, his words pouring out like a river breaking a dam. "My family declared me dead because I'm gay, because I love a man, because I refused to live a lie to make them comfortable." He gestured to Mateo, who stepped into frame, his hand on Ezra's shoulder. "This is Mateo Alvarez, the man I love. And this is the truth they tried to bury." The internet erupted. Clips of Ezra's speech went viral within hours, shared by activists, influencers, and strangers moved by his courage. In Atlanta, the church scrambled to cut the feed, but it was too late. Ezra's words had reached thousands, then millions. Support poured in, messages from queer youth, allies, even people who'd attended his mother's church and now questioned her teachings. But the victory was bittersweet. Ezra's phone buzzed with a text from his sister, Naomi, the only family member who'd ever wavered in her rejection. "I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd go this far." He stared at the words, torn between hope and hurt. Could he trust her? Could he trust any of them? As the day wound down, Ezra and Mateo sat on their rooftop, the city sprawling below. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a quiet contrast to the chaos of the day. Mateo rested his head on Ezra's shoulder. "You did it," he murmured. "You showed them who you are." Ezra nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. On the family he'd lost, the fight still ahead. He wasn't just a symbol. He was a man, with scars and dreams and a love worth fighting for. And as the stars began to speckle the sky, he knew this was only the beginning. The fallout from Ezra's broadcast was like a wildfire, uncontrollable, consuming, and impossible to ignore. By the next morning, his face was plastered across news sites, from CNN to local blogs. Hashtags like Ezra is alive and Love is not dead trended on X, with thousands sharing their own stories of rejection and resilience. Ezra scrolled through the posts on his phone, his emotions a tangled mix of pride and exhaustion. He'd wanted to be heard, but he hadn't expected the world to listen so loudly. Mateo, ever the organizer, was already planning next steps. "We need to keep the momentum," he said over breakfast, his dark eyes scanning his laptop. "There's a rally in Manhattan tomorrow, queer youth groups, allies, even some faith leaders who denounced your family's church. They want you to speak." Ezra froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Speak? In front of a crowd? The funeral crash had been one thing, fueled by adrenaline and anger, but this felt different, exposing him to a new kind of scrutiny. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice low. Mateo reached across the table, his fingers brushing Ezra's. "You don't have to be a hero, Amor. Just be you. That's enough." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of Mateo's unwavering belief in him. Ezra nodded, though doubt lingered like a shadow. Lila burst into the apartment an hour later, her energy electric. "You're not going to believe this," she said, tossing her backpack onto the couch. "Your mom's church just issued a statement." She pulled up the text on her phone, reading aloud, "We mourn the loss of Ezra's soul to sin, but we stand by our actions as an act of love to save him." Ezra's stomach twisted. Love? That word in their mouths felt like a blade. "They're doubling down," Mateo said, his jaw tight. "They're not sorry, they're defiant." Lila nodded, her fingers already typing. "But they're losing followers. Their donation page is getting hammered with negative reviews, and half their congregation is questioning them online." She grinned. "You shook their foundation, Ezra." The news should have felt like a victory, but it only deepened Ezra's unease. He thought of Naomi's text, the crack in her armor. Was she questioning their mother too? Or was it just guilt talking? He hadn't responded to her yet, unsure if he could open that door again. His family had built a wall between them, brick by brick, and this funeral was the final stone. Yet a part of him, a small, stubborn part, still hoped for reconciliation. That afternoon, Ezra and Mateo met with the rally organizers at a community center in Harlem. The room buzzed with energy. A trans teenager designing posters, a non-binary poet practicing their piece, a lesbian couple coordinating volunteers. Ezra felt out of place, like an imposter in a movement bigger than himself. But when a 16-year-old named Kai approached him, eyes wide with awe, he faltered. "I saw your video," Kai said, their voice trembling. "My parents kicked me out last year. Seeing you, it made me feel like I could keep going." Ezra's throat tightened. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He hugged Kai, the gesture awkward but sincere, and promised to speak at the rally. As they left the center, Mateo squeezed his hand. "See? You're already changing lives." The rally was held in a small park near Washington Square, the air crisp with autumn. Hundreds gathered, their signs a rainbow of defiance. Love wins, queer and here, faith without hate. Ezra stood backstage, his heart pounding as he watched Mateo charm the crowd with his opening remarks. The man was a natural, confident, warm, his voice carrying hope like a torch. Ezra envied that ease, but he drew strength from it too. When it was his turn, he stepped onto the makeshift stage, the crowd's cheers both exhilarating and overwhelming. He gripped the microphone, his red tie catching the sunlight. "I'm Ezra Jackson," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "And I'm still here." The crowd roared, and he found his rhythm, telling his story. Not just the funeral, but the years of shame, the nights he'd cried himself to sleep, the moment he'd found love with Matteo and realized he was enough. He spoke of his mother, her sermons that once felt like gospel but now rang hollow. He spoke of the kids like Kai, who deserved better than rejection dressed up as love. And he spoke of hope, not the naive kind, but the hard-won kind, forged in pain and defiance. When he finished, the applause was deafening, and Matteo pulled him into a hug so tight it felt like it could hold the world together. But the high didn't last. That night, a news alert pinged. Evelyn Jackson was holding a press conference the next day to address the controversy. Ezra's stomach sank. His mother wasn't one to back down. She'd built her church on unwavering conviction. Whatever she had planned, it wouldn't be an apology. Ezra barely slept, his mind racing with what-ifs. By morning, he and Matteo were glued to Lila's laptop, watching the live stream of Evelyn's press conference. She stood at a podium in her church's fellowship hall, her face a mask of calm authority. "My son has chosen a path of sin," she said, her voice steady. "We declared him dead to symbolize his spiritual death, to call him back to God's light." The words hit Ezra like a punch. Spiritual death? He'd never felt more alive than when he was with Matteo, when he was building a life true to himself. Matteo's hand found his, grounding him as Evelyn continued, her words laced with scripture and self-righteousness. She painted Ezra as a prodigal son, lost but not beyond saving, if he'd only repent. The internet's response was swift. Supporters rallied around Ezra, but others, emboldened by Evelyn's words, spewed hate. Comments called him an abomination, a disgrace. Matteo shut the laptop, his eyes blazing. "Enough. She doesn't get to define you." Ezra nodded, but the venom stung. He thought of Naomi again, her text still unanswered. Could she be swayed? Or was she too deep in their mother's orbit? He typed a reply, his fingers hesitating. "I'm still your brother. Can we talk?" He hit send before he could overthink it. As the day wore on, Ezra felt the weight of his newfound visibility. Reporters emailed, activists called, and strangers messaged him with both love and hate. He was no longer just Ezra Jackson, graphic designer. He was a symbol, a story, a spark. And while that gave him purpose, it also terrified him. What if he wasn't strong enough to carry it? Naomi's response came late that night, a single line, "Meet me in Atlanta, tomorrow, please." Ezra stared at the text, his heart caught between hope and suspicion. Matteo, reading over his shoulder, frowned. "You sure about this, amor? Could be a trap." Ezra wasn't sure, but something in Naomi's words felt different, desperate, almost. He booked a flight, and Matteo insisted on coming, refusing to let him face his family alone. The flight to Atlanta was tense, the hum of the plane doing little to calm Ezra's nerves. He hadn't been back since that fateful dinner, and the city loomed in his mind like a haunted house. Matteo held his hand during takeoff, his thumb tracing circles on Ezra's skin. "Whatever happens," he said, "we're in this together." Ezra nodded, drawing strength from the man beside him. They landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the air thick with humidity and memories. Naomi had asked to meet at a small coffee shop in Midtown, far from their mother's church. When Ezra and Matteo walked in, they spotted her at a corner table, her face drawn, her hands wrapped around a mug. At 25, Naomi looked older than her years, her eyes carrying the weight of their family's dogma. "Ezra," she said, standing as they approached. Her voice trembled, and for a moment, Ezra saw the sister who'd once snuck him extra cookies, who'd laughed with him until their sides ached. But then he remembered her silence when their mother cast him out, and his guard went up. "Why now?" he asked, sitting across from her. Mateo stayed close, his presence a quiet anchor. Naomi's eyes darted to him, then back to Ezra. "I didn't know they'd go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The funeral, it was Mom's idea, but I didn't stop her. I should have." Ezra's chest tightened. "You could have called. You could have texted. 3 years, Naomi." His voice cracked, and Mateo's hand found his under the table. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared," she admitted. "Mom said you were lost, that praying for you was all we could do. But after your video I saw you, really saw you, and I realized I was wrong." The confession hung between them, fragile and heavy. Ezra wanted to believe her, but trust was a bridge long burned. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, then slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Some of us at the church, younger members, a few deacons, were questioning Mom. We want to talk to you. Not here. At the church, tonight." Ezra exchanged a glance with Mateo, whose eyes screamed caution. "This feels like a setup," Mateo said, his voice low but firm. Naomi shook her head. "It's not, I swear. They're meeting in secret. Mom doesn't know." Ezra studied her face, searching for deceit. All he saw was a sister trying to make amends, or at least trying to try. That evening, they drove to the church under a sky bruised with clouds. It was a modest building, its steeple a stark silhouette against the dusk. Ezra's heart raced as they approached the back entrance, where Naomi waited. She led them to a basement room, where a dozen people sat in a circle. Mostly young, a mix of black, white, and Latino faces, all looking nervous but determined. A woman in her early 30s, introduced as Deacon Sarah, spoke first. "We saw your video, Ezra. It woke us up. Your mom's been preaching love, but what she did to you, that's not love." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. A young man, maybe 19, added, "I'm gay too. I've been hiding it because of her sermons. But you gave me hope." Ezra's throat tightened. These were people raised in his mother's fire and brimstone world. Yet here they were, risking everything to question it. He shared his story again, this time unscripted, raw. He spoke of the pain of rejection, the joy of finding Mateo, the fight to reclaim his truth. Mateo chimed in, his voice steady, talking about the broader fight for queer acceptance, even in places as hard as this. The meeting stretched late, the air thick with emotion. Some cried. Others hugged Ezra, thanking him for his courage. But as they prepared to leave, Naomi grabbed his arm. "Mom knows," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. Someone tipped her off. "She's coming." Ezra's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, the basement door swung open, and Evelyn Jackson stood there, her presence commanding and cold. The room fell silent, the air electric with tension. "Ezra," she said, her voice like steel, "you dare come into my house, spreading your sin?" Mateo stepped forward, his body shielding Ezra's. "This isn't about sin. It's about your son, who's alive and deserves your love." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but Ezra saw a flicker of something. Doubt? Pain? Before her mask slipped back into place. "You're no son of mine," she said, but her voice wavered, just for a moment. Ezra found his voice. "I'm not here to fight you, Mom. I'm here to live. And I'm not alone anymore." He gestured to the group, to Mateo, to Naomi, who stood trembling but resolute. Evelyn's gaze swept the room, landing on her daughter. Naomi, you're part of this? Naomi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I can't keep pretending, Mom. He's my brother. The words hit like a thunderclap, and for the first time, Evelyn looked shaken. She turned and left without another word, the door slamming behind her. The encounter left Ezra reeling, but it also lit a spark. The group vowed to keep meeting to push for change within the church. Naomi promised to stay in touch. Her apology a fragile bridge Ezra wasn't sure he could cross yet. As he and Mateo drove back to their hotel, the weight of the day settled over him. He'd faced his mother, seen her falter, but the wound was still raw. You were incredible, Mateo said, his hand resting on Ezra's knee. You didn't just stand up to her. You gave those people hope. Ezra managed a small smile, but his mind was on Evelyn's face, the crack in her armor. Could she change? Did he even want her to, after everything? Back in their hotel room, Ezra checked his phone. Messages flooded in, support from the rally, updates from Lila about the growing online movement, even a note from Kai, the teen from the community center, saying they'd come out to their foster family and found acceptance. Each message was a reminder of why he'd fought, why he'd keep fighting. Back in New York, the movement Ezra had sparked grew louder. Activists organized more rallies, and a petition circulated demanding the church retract its obituary and issue a public apology. Ezra's story was no longer just his. It was a beacon for queer youth, a challenge to religious dogma, a call for love over judgment. But with visibility came pressure. Reporters camped outside his apartment, and his inbox overflowed with interview requests. He felt like he was drowning in his own story. Mateo noticed the strain. One evening, as they sat on their couch, he pulled Ezra close. You don't have to say yes to everything, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This fight is bigger than us, but you're still human. Ezra nodded, his head resting against Mateo's chest. The steady rhythm of his partner's heartbeat was the only thing keeping him grounded. Lila, ever the strategist, suggested they channel the energy into something tangible. What if we start a fund? She proposed over pizza one night. For queer kids who've been kicked out like Kai, we could call it the Ezra Fund. Ezra blinked, caught off guard. A fund in his name felt too big, too real. But the idea stuck, and within days they were working with a local nonprofit to set it up. Donations poured in, fueled by the viral momentum of Ezra's story. Meanwhile, Naomi kept texting, updating him on the church's internal strife. The secret group had grown, and several members had left, publicly denouncing Evelyn's actions. Naomi herself was wavering, torn between her faith and her brother. I'm trying, Ezra, she wrote. I want to understand. Her words were a lifeline, but Ezra guarded his heart, wary of more pain. Then came the bombshell. A national news outlet invited Ezra and Mateo to a live TV interview to discuss their story and the growing movement. It was a chance to reach millions, to amplify the voices of kids like Kai. But it also meant facing tougher questions, more scrutiny. Ezra hesitated, but Mateo's quiet confidence pushed him forward. We've got this, he said, kissing Ezra's forehead. Together. The studio was blinding, the lights hot against Ezra's skin. The host, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Nguyen, greeted them warmly but didn't sugarcoat her questions. Ezra, your family declared you dead for being gay. How do you move forward from that kind of rejection? The camera zoomed in, and Ezra felt the weight of a million eyes. He glanced at Mateo, who gave him a subtle nod. I don't know if I can move forward with them, Ezra admitted, his voice raw. But I'm moving forward for myself, for my partner, for every kid who's been told they're not enough. He spoke of the Ezra Fund, of Kai's courage, of the love that had carried him through. Mateo added, "This isn't just about us. It's about building a world where no one has to hide who they are." The interview aired to millions, and the response was overwhelming. Donations to the Ezra Fund spiked, and messages poured in from across the globe. But not all were kind. Hate mail arrived too, accusing Ezra of tearing his family apart, of defying God. One letter, handwritten and postmarked from Atlanta, stopped him cold. It was from his father, Samuel, who'd been silent through it all. "I failed you," it read. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying." Ezra didn't know how to feel. His father's words were a crack in the wall, but they didn't erase the years of silence. He showed the letter to Mateo, who read it quietly. "Maybe he's waking up," Mateo said, but his tone was cautious. "What do you want to do?" Ezra didn't have an answer, not yet. The next week, Ezra and Mateo attended a fundraiser for the Ezra Fund at a Brooklyn community center. The room was packed. Activists, donors, queer youth, even a few progressive faith leaders. Kai was there, beaming as they introduced Ezra to their foster siblings. "This is the guy who saved me," Kai said, and Ezra's eyes stung. He wasn't a savior, but he was starting to believe he could make a difference. As the event wound down, Naomi called. "I'm leaving the church," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I can't stay in a place that hurts people like you." Ezra's breath caught. "Where will you go?" he asked. Naomi laughed, a sound both sad and free. "I don't know. Maybe New York? I want to meet Mateo properly. I want to know my brother again." The call ended, and Ezra turned to Mateo, tears in his eyes. "She's coming around," he whispered. Mateo pulled him into a hug, and for the first time in weeks, Ezra felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. Months passed, and the Ezra Fund grew into a lifeline for queer youth across the country. Ezra and Mateo worked tirelessly, balancing their day jobs with advocacy. The fund provided scholarships, housing, and counseling, and Ezra's story became a rallying cry for change. But the personal toll was heavy. Ezra struggled with the constant spotlight, the hate mail, the weight of being a symbol. Mateo was his rock, but even he couldn't shield Ezra from the nightmares. Dreams of his mother's voice, calling him dead. Naomi arrived in New York in the spring, renting a small apartment in Queens. She and Ezra met weekly, rebuilding their bond over coffee and long walks. She was unlearning years of dogma, asking questions, listening to Ezra and Mateo's stories. It wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, moments when Ezra wondered if they could ever fully heal. But Naomi was trying, and that was more than he'd ever expected. One day, a package arrived from Atlanta. Inside was a photo album, filled with pictures of Ezra as a child, laughing at birthday parties, hugging Naomi, even sitting in church beside his parents. A note from his father was tucked inside. "I'm still learning, Ezra. I hope one day you'll let me try to be your father again." Ezra cried as he flipped through the album, Mateo's arm around him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The turning point came unexpectedly. Evelyn's church, battered by controversy and defections, announced a new initiative, a series of listening sessions for queer members and allies. Naomi, who'd kept in touch with the dissident group, told Ezra it was their doing, a push to reform from within. Evelyn herself would attend, though she hadn't committed to speaking. Ezra was skeptical, but Naomi begged him to come. "She's not the same, Ezra. She's struggling. I think she's starting to see." Against his better judgment, Ezra agreed, and he and Mateo flew back to Atlanta. The session was held in a community center, not the church, a neutral ground. The room was packed, the air thick with tension and hope. Evelyn sat in the front row, her face unreadable. Ezra spoke first, sharing his journey, his pain, his love. Others followed. A trans teen, a bisexual deacon, a mother who'd lost her son to suicide after rejection. The stories were raw, unflinching, and Ezra saw his mother's hands tremble, her eyes glistening. When it was her turn, Evelyn stood, her voice unsteady. "I thought I was saving my son," she said, her words halting. "I thought love meant correction. I was wrong." The room went silent, the weight of her admission seismic. She looked at Ezra, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want to try to understand." Ezra's heart pounded. He wanted to run, to scream, to hug her. Instead, he stood and walked to her, Mateo at his side. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," he said, his voice breaking. "But I'm here." They didn't embrace, but the space between them felt less like a chasm. A year later, Ezra stood on that rooftop in Brooklyn, the city glittering below. Mateo was beside him, their hands intertwined, the sunset painting them in gold. The Ezra Fund had expanded. Naomi was thriving in her new life, and Evelyn was slowly, imperfectly trying to change. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still scars, still fights to be fought, but it was enough. Ezra looked at Mateo, his heart full. "We did it," he whispered. Mateo smiled, pulling him close. "No, amor, you did it, and I'm so damn proud." As the stars emerged, Ezra felt it. The truth he'd fought for, the love that had carried him through. He was alive, undeniably, gloriously alive.